Right now, every cinema camera and every mirrorless camera look and act pretty much the same. They all have basically the same headlining features and they all have basically the same ergonomics. But it wasn't always like that. Camera companies used to be weird and used to try stuff, and they used to honestly make some pretty interesting cameras. But today's list, I want to talk about cameras that should have been great, but weren't. Some of these you might have heard about, some of them hopefully you haven't. All right, first up on this list is a camera made by a company called Canon called the 1DC. Now this camera was really interesting. It had like basically the same ergonomics as something like a 1DX or what we now would be like an R3 or an R1, but it was made for cinema line. It was actually, I think, one of the first cameras that was actually part of the Canon cinema lineup. Now we have things like the C400 and the C70 and the C300 Mark III and the C500. But back then, this was a pretty big deal. There weren't a whole lot of ergonomically friendly and user-friendly cinema cameras that you could just like pick up, go out and use as like a normal camera, especially ones that were cinema cameras. Yeah, you could shoot video on cameras that were of this style in nature, but they weren't specifically oriented towards the cinematics, which is the niche that the 1DC was trying to fill. And to a degree, they did it. But as a camera, it was not the best. First of all, the price of the camera was kind of crazy. It was like largely inaccessible. And I understand why they did that, because they were making it a cinema camera. It was supposed to be advertised towards people that were used to seeing prices in the $20,000 to $30,000 range. So this actually probably looked pretty reasonable to them. However, to everybody else that wanted to use the camera, mainly people that were building on the shoulders of the 5D Mark II, which sort of started the whole DSLR and mirrorless camera revolution. The 1DC was basically inaccessible from a financial standpoint. The other problem with the 1DC was that it was massive, very difficult to rig, and it absolutely ripped through batteries, which from a run and gun point of view is really difficult to justify using. And the other thing was that it used up a lot of data in its memory card, but it didn't actually record what we would consider nowadays a high quality image, because it was only 8-bit. Now, it was like DCI, if I remember correctly, which was pretty innovative at the time. However, the 8-bit nature of the content that you could shoot on it just didn't match the amount of data that you were actually making. It was really robust, but sort of in the wrong way. Nowadays, you can actually find a 1DC for sale for like very little money. However, I would caution you against buying it, because for the amount of money that you could spend on a 1DC now, you could actually get a legitimately great mirrorless camera from a brand like Fuji or Sony and have demonstrably better video quality come out of it, just from a data standpoint. But we have to acknowledge that like this was basically the pioneering camera from Canon to launch the cinema line into the user-friendly world that it exists in today. So thank you for your service, 1DC. You were terrible. All right, the next two I'm talking about are both from Blackmagic. You know anything about cameras, you probably saw this one coming. I'm not talking about the original pocket camera though. That thing is awesome. Even though it had a 45-minute battery life and it overheated with the cycle of each breath, the fact that you could shoot like log really good high quality cinematic imagery in a camera that was basically the size of a point and shoot camera was legitimately amazing. I actually love that camera, and that might be one worth picking up right now. But no, the first Blackmagic camera we're talking about is the original Blackmagic cinema camera. We've seen like the Ursa Cines and the Ursa Pros, and we've seen the new pocket cameras, which are not pocketable at all. And they all owe all of their success this weird silver and black rubber camera that had no removable battery and shot on 2.5-inch SSD drives called the Blackmagic cinema camera. I remember when this came out, I actually had this camera as like the background on my laptop because I wanted it so bad. Legitimately, this camera looks so cool, and I wish that it would have worked better, but it just didn't work properly. At least not out of the box. Like, you had to do so much to that camera to get it to work the way that you would want that camera to work. What do I mean by it didn't work? Well, first of all, it was a camera that, big surprise to Blackmagic, rips through battery life. The problem with this camera was that there was no removable battery in this camera at all. The only way to charge it was through barrel connector and like some whatever external power source that you could use. There were a bunch of really crazy rigs that came out that tried to solve this problem, but at the end of the day, you had to have it rigged up on some sort of setup that used either V-mount or gold mount or a number of like really strange like backpack solutions or hip mounted solutions that I saw. No matter what you did, it was like some sort of ergonomic disaster. The other crazy thing about this camera was that it shot to like SSDs, and that's pretty normal today with like Samsung T5s, but this one shot to 2.5-inch like internal SATA drive SSDs, which is actually, Blackmagic is going back to that now. So maybe they're just getting back to their roots with the new like Ursa Cine line. But at the time, this was really difficult because nobody was really doing this, which meant that nobody knew how to manage it once you actually recorded it. You had to like build the infrastructure as you were shooting, which from an independent standpoint is kind of a pain in the butt. But the weirdest thing about this camera, and it's still weird to me today, is it had a micro 4/3 sensor, but a Canon EF mount for the lenses. And I don't know of any Canon camera that has a micro 4/3 sensor. So like the lens to sensor makeup was like very strange to me. So you had to somehow figure out lensing with a Canon EF mount that could cover a micro 4/3 sensor. Now, that problem doesn't really exist on the long end when you think about like 70 mil and on. But like 35 mil and wider is really, really difficult in terms of like what the image ends up looking like. You have to shoot on something like an 8mm lens to get like a decent looking image from an ultra wide or even a wide angle point of view. Because like on a micro 4/3 sensor, 8mm is actually has the field of view of 16. So when you put your normal like 16mm on this camera, which you would normally have with an EF mount, it was actually more like a 32mm, which is not what you're going for when you put a 16mm lens on camera. It's just not typically what you're looking for. So this really strange lens mount to sensor combination was so bizarre. And for me, never really worked properly. But here's the thing about that camera. This was like, for me, the first like box style camera and paved the way for cameras like the Komodo, the Pixis, the Raptor, the Alexa Mini. They all sort of owe their lineage to this ambitious design from Blackmagic, and I have got to respect them for that. The next camera that I'm talking about is another Blackmagic camera, and it was massive. It was huge. It was the original Ursa. Now you're probably familiar with like the Ursa Mini Pro, the Ursa Mini Pro 4.6, the 4.6 G2. You're even probably familiar with the Ursa Mini 12K and the Ursa Cine 12K and the Ursa 17K. You probably know about those. But what you don't know is that all of those are based off of the Ursa Mini platform. Did you know that there was the regular Ursa platform, which was an absolute behemoth of a camera? The Ursa lineup actually started with the original Ursa, which was a 4K global shutter camera that weighed like 14 pounds with nothing on it, just the camera, and had like an 11-inch screen that you folded out that was made to be like the AC screen, which was basically an iPad. Then you had to add your lenses and your battery. So at the end of the day, a small setup on this camera was something like 20 pounds because you have a cinema camera on the front, you got a V-mount battery on the back or a gold mount, whatever. And not only that, you have a 10.5-inch or 11-inch screen folding out the side. So it's just this big honking thing. And it didn't come with a shoulder mount at all. So that was just sitting on sticks or handheld if you were an absolute unit. And honestly, like, it produced a great image, and I really wish that I would have shot with it more. But at the end of the day, it was just so heavy and cumbersome that, like, unless you had a full crew, you didn't really want to take it out because it just slowed you down. However, I do have to give credit to this camera because it basically set the standard for Blackmagic image quality, which we all know and love to this day. It is a very robust image, and this camera, I think, really helped them develop that image to what it is today. So again, thank you, Blackmagic Ursa. Also, you're a huge b****. Last one is something that I don't think you've heard of because it's called the AJA CION. Now, AJA is a company that has made a lot of amazing moves in the space of external recording, particularly with like really gnarly video codecs. They've also done a lot for various switchers, various transmitters, and various different ways of just generally dealing with image inside of the pipeline after it comes out of the camera. So they know what they're talking about when it comes to data management. And that is really where they came up with their idea for their camera. They wanted to build something that was their entire pipeline, but on your shoulder. And the ergonomics of this camera are still some of the best that I've ever seen in a cinema camera. What they did was they actually built in a shoulder mount into the body of the camera and then lined it with a good soft material. So it was genuinely a comfortable camera to hold all day long, despite the fact that it was the size of an Alexa LF, not an Alexa Mini LF, the big one. And while the ergonomics of it were definitely the best thing that to this day I've ever seen in a cinema camera, that's kind of where the good stuff stops. The I/O of the camera was very strange. And by that I mean, in order to get a 4K image out of the camera, you actually had to use 4 SDI cables at the same time. The other thing that they did was they used proprietary media. And while AJA is no stranger to using proprietary media, from a camera standpoint, it's a massive pain in the butt. Red also did this with their mags and mini mags when they had the DSMC2 lineup of cameras. I will never forget that. But it was pretty cool. It had a PL mount, so you could mount cinema lenses on it with total ease. And it had a global shutter, which to this day is still very uncommon in the cinema world. Some of our favorite cameras don't have a global shutter to this day. However, the image quality that came out of this camera sucked so much. It was like 12 stops of dynamic range, which was basically the same as the Canon T2i, and it had a really bad roll-off to the highlights. The shadows were okay if you had enough light, but the highlights would just clip super easy, and there was no gradient from when you had information to when you didn't have information, and it was just completely unusable, despite the fact that it was, by all accounts, one of the most beautiful cameras I've ever seen. It just didn't have anything else going for it. It was very much style over substance. For them to make that big of a mistake was kind of a letdown. And it was a letdown because I really wanted to use that camera more, but as soon as I got the image into the post-production workflow, it just fell apart, and I only used it once. You can still get the camera today on the secondhand market, but I simply wouldn't recommend it, solely based on the fact that the image quality is just so bad. Let me know what you think of this list, and if there are cameras that I left off, leave them in the comments below. I can't wait to hear what you think. Anyways, peace.